Forget the pyramids and mummies. The most shocking secret of ancient Egypt isn't buried in a tomb. It's carved on their temple walls in plain sight. For 3,000 years, the Egyptians built their civilization on a view of creation and fertility so radical, it still shocks us today. Their holiest creation story began not with a divine word, but with an act of cosmic self-pleasure. Their pharaohs, considered living gods, were expected to marry their own sisters to maintain a pure bloodline. And their major public festivals were not somber ceremonies, but massive, open celebrations of life and procreation, led by priests of the perpetually aroused fertility god, Min. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. This wasn't some fringe cult or hidden practice. This was mainstream Egyptian religion and daily life for over 3 millennia. While other ancient civilizations were developing concepts of modesty and shame, Egyptians were holding public festivals celebrating fertility and life. They had no word for virginity. Women had freedoms that wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. They understood human anatomy and birth control better than European doctors would until the 1800s. So buckle up, because we're about to explore how the most successful civilization in human history put life creation at the center of everything, and why modern society might have misunderstood their wisdom. Let's start with the most extraordinary creation story you've never heard. Forget Adam and Eve, forget the Big Bang. The ancient Egyptians believed the universe began with divine self-generation. And I'm not talking about some obscure myth hidden in dusty scrolls. This was the official story of how everything came to exist, taught in temples, celebrated in festivals, and literally carved into pyramid walls. The god, Atum, floating alone in the primordial waters of chaos, had no companion. So what did he do? He created through his own divine power, literally bringing forth existence through solitary generation. And from that singular act came the first gods, the first humans, and eventually, an entire civilization that would make creation the cornerstone of their religion. Here's where it gets really fascinating. They didn't see this as crude or shameful. They saw it as the most sacred act in existence. And wait until you hear what they did to honor it. The Heliopolitan creation myth, recorded in the pyramid texts dating back to 2400 BCE, explicitly describes how Atum performed the first creative act. The hieroglyphic texts are surprisingly detailed. Atum is described as he who created himself, who brought himself into being, and generated Shu and Tefnut from himself. Shu became the god of air, Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. But here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't metaphorical or symbolic. The ancient Egyptian language had specific words for self-generation, and they used them in these religious texts. The coffin texts from the Middle Kingdom period get even more explicit, describing how Atum took his creative power in hand and achieved the first divine act that sparked creation. The truly remarkable part? This act became so sacred that the title God's Hand became one of the highest honors a woman could receive in ancient Egypt. Queens and high priestesses of the New Kingdom proudly bore this title, understanding that they symbolically represented the divine creative force that helped bring the universe into being. Queen Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most powerful female pharaohs, specifically claimed this title and had it carved into her mortuary temple. Imagine if religious leaders today had titles referencing the creation story so directly. That's the level of mainstream acceptance we're talking about. Temple walls throughout Egypt depict this creation scene. The Temple of Karnak, visited by millions of tourists annually, contains reliefs showing Atum in the act of self-generation. The Temple of Dendera has an entire chapel dedicated to the first time, the moment of divine creation that started everything. These weren't hidden in secret chambers, they were displayed prominently where worshippers would see them during religious ceremonies. Modern tour guides often skip these explanations, but the ancient Egyptians made sure everyone understood exactly how their universe began. Here's what's really mind-blowing. This creation myth shaped every aspect of Egyptian understanding of life for the next 3,000 years. If the supreme god created existence through self-generation, then human creativity and fertility weren't shameful or sinful, they were literally divine. The annual flooding of the Nile, which Egyptian civilization depended on, was understood as continuation of divine creative force fertilizing the land. The life-giving waters that appeared were seen as divine blessing, bringing abundance to Egypt. Priests would perform rituals echoing Atum's creative act to ensure the floods came on schedule. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. In 2007, researchers discovered a papyrus in the Turin Museum that had been mistranslated for decades. When properly interpreted, it revealed detailed instructions for a religious ritual where priests would simulate the creative act while chanting creation hymns. The Brooklyn Museum houses a statue from the late period showing a priest in a position of reverence to creation. These artifacts prove this wasn't abstract theology, it was practiced religion. Why did the Egyptians develop this unique creation story? The answer reveals their sophisticated understanding of biology and nature. They observed that life came from bodily generation. Creation led to new life. Floodwaters created crops. In a desert civilization entirely dependent on the Nile's annual flood, the connection between life-giving forces and creation made perfect sense. Unlike the Mesopotamian creation myths involving violent battles between gods, or the Hebrew story of divine speech creating light, the Egyptians went straight to the biological source of creation. This foundation myth had profound implications for Egyptian society. Women weren't seen as passive vessels, as in Greek philosophy. Instead, they were active participants in the creative process, symbolically representing divine creative power. Self-generation wasn't shameful but a sacred echo of the first divine act. Temple practices throughout the ancient Near East took on religious significance as recreation of divine creativity. The entire Egyptian understanding of gender, reproduction, and religious duty stemmed from this primal scene of divine creation. The influence extended to Egyptian medicine and science. The Kahun gynecological papyrus, dating to 1800 BCE, shows remarkable understanding of human reproduction, likely stemming from religious study of divine creation. Egyptian doctors understood the connection between generation and conception centuries before other civilizations. They developed some of the world's first fertility treatments based on religious principles derived from their creation myth. Modern Egyptologists were initially so surprised by these texts that many early translations were deliberately sanitized. Victorian scholars like E.A. Wallace Budge simply refused to translate the explicit sections, leaving them in hieroglyphics or replacing them with Latin euphemisms. It wasn't until the social revolutions of the 1960s that accurate translations became publicly available. Even today, many museum exhibitions gloss over these aspects of Egyptian religion, presenting a sanitized version that would have baffled the ancient Egyptians themselves. Imagine walking into Sunday school and being taught that God created the universe through self-generation. Parents would be shocked, but for ancient Egyptians, this wasn't scandalous, it was sacred. While we hide discussions of creation behind euphemisms, they carved it on temple walls. And speaking of temples, wait until you hear about the god they worshipped as the embodiment of fertility. If you thought divine creation was surprising, the festival of Min is going to amaze you. Because unlike Atum, who was alone in the cosmic void, Min was very much present in Egyptian cities, and his worship involved public displays that would make modern celebrations look tame. Now let's talk about the most prominent fertility deity in human history, a god who was literally worshipped for his representation of masculine creative power. Min wasn't some minor deity hidden in the shadows. He was one of Egypt's most important gods, dating back 6,000 years, and his festivals were the ancient equivalent of Mardi Gras, meets a fertility celebration, meets a religious ceremony. Picture this: massive processions through cities, carrying statues of a god representing virility, while priests offered lettuce, yes, lettuce, because when you cut it, white sap emerges that reminded them of life-giving properties. Foreign visitors were so shocked they could barely describe what they saw. But here's the truly remarkable part. This wasn't considered inappropriate. This was serious religious business, essential for ensuring the Nile would flood and crops would grow. Min's iconography is absolutely unmistakable. Every single depiction shows him as a symbol of fertility and regeneration, usually prominently displayed, painted black to represent the fertile soil of the Nile Valley. But here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't artistic exaggeration. Temple statues of Min, some over 20 feet tall, featured full representations of masculine power. The colossal Min statue at Coptos, discovered in 1894, was so explicitly depicted that the Victorian excavators tried to modify it. Fortunately, they failed. and we can still see the god as ancient Egyptians worshipped him. The festival of Min, held during the harvest season, makes modern celebrations look subdued by comparison. Here's what actually happened. According to multiple ancient sources, the pharaoh himself would lead a procession carrying Min's statue through the streets. Priests walked alongside carrying massive amounts of lettuce, not for eating, but because lettuce was considered an aphrodisiac due to its milky sap. Women would line the streets and perform ritual gestures toward the statue, sometimes dancing, in ritual acts meant to honor the god and ensure fertility. The procession would end at special Min chapels, where sacred rituals took place. The Greek historian Herodotus, visiting Egypt in 450 BCE, was so amazed by Min worship that he wrote, "What I witnessed in the temples of this god, I can barely bring myself to describe in detail, though I have no doubt of what mine eyes beheld." Roman writers were equally shocked. Plutarch described seeing women openly venerating Min statues in ways that would cause Jupiter himself to blush. These weren't considered inappropriate acts. They were religious obligations. Women trying to conceive would perform ritual honors with Min statues in ways that showed deep religious devotion. Archaeological evidence confirms these ancient accounts. In 1998, a team working in the Luxor temple discovered a hidden chamber containing dozens of small Min figurines, each showing signs of ritual use. Analysis showed traces of ancient oils and offerings, confirming their religious purpose. The team leader later said finding this cache was like discovering an ancient ritual chamber, except it was a chapel. The figurines dated from multiple periods, showing this practice continued for thousands of years. But here's the really remarkable part. Min wasn't just worshipped in temples. Every Egyptian home had a Min shrine, usually in private quarters. Small Min amulets were worn as jewelry, with his symbols proudly displayed. Children wore Min charms for protection. Imagine giving your kid a fertility symbol today. It would be controversial. But for Egyptians, this was as normal as wearing any religious symbol. The Cairo Museum has over 10,000 Min amulets in its collection, and that's just what survived. The public nature of Min worship shocked foreign visitors for millennia. When Napoleon's expedition reached Egypt in 1798, French soldiers reported seeing rural Min festivals that left them speechless. One officer wrote, "The natives parade fertility symbols through their villages with such enthusiasm that our men are amazed by their openness." British Victorian travellers were so disturbed they campaigned to have Min statues removed from public view. Many were hidden in museum basements where they remain today. Modern discoveries keep revealing just how central Min was to Egyptian life. In 2019, archaeologists found a brewery near Abydos with Min symbols on every storage jar. Analysis showed the beer was brewed with herbs known to enhance vitality. This wasn't just religious symbolism, they were literally brewing special beer for Min festivals. The brewery could produce over 22,000 litres at a time, suggesting these festivals involved the entire population, celebrating fertility while honouring their deity. Min's influence on Egyptian culture can't be overstated. The hieroglyph for virility is literally Min's symbol. The word for fertility incorporates his sacred lettuce. Even Egyptian architecture reflected Min worship. Pillars were designed to echo upright strength, and doorways symbolized passages of life. The famous obelisks that now decorate cities worldwide. They're essentially monuments to regenerative power, though your tour guide won't mention that. The economic importance of Min worship explains its prominence. Egypt's survival depended on agricultural fertility and human reproduction. Min embodied both. His festivals coincided with planting and harvest times. The celebrations associated with his worship weren't just religious, they were practical fertility rituals. Temple records show birth rates increased 9 months after major Min festivals. The gods delivered on their promises, even if through very human means. Today, fertility symbols would be controversial faster than you can say community guidelines, but ancient Egyptians paraded them through streets like it was the most natural thing in the world. They understood something we've forgotten, that fertility and reproduction are literally what keeps civilization going. But if you think public fertility worship was extreme, wait until you hear about what Egyptian royalty did to keep their bloodlines pure. And by pure, I mean something that would be completely taboo today. Because when your gods are creating the universe, and your fertility deity is prominently displayed, Marrying within the family starts to seem like part of the divine plan. Here's where Egyptian practices go from unusual to absolutely shocking by modern standards. Remember how European royalty married cousins? And we think that's unusual? Egyptian pharaohs took it much further. They regularly married siblings and daughters, sometimes both. This wasn't some dark secret or occasional scandal. Royal intermarriage was official policy, religious duty, and the foundation of divine kingship for over 3,000 years. We're talking about a civilization where Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings, where Cleopatra married 2 of her brothers, and where Ramesses II married several of his daughters. The genetic test results on mummies are so unusual that scientists initially thought their equipment was malfunctioning. But here's the really complex part. They had religious justification that made perfect sense within their worldview. Let's start with the most famous example, King Tutankhamun. When researchers finally got permission to analyze his remains in 2010, they expected to find some close family relationships. What they discovered was a complex family tree. Tut's parents weren't just related, they were full siblings. His grandparents on both sides were the same people. The young king showed multiple health issues, a club foot, severe scoliosis, and other conditions that made walking difficult. He needed a cane to walk at age 19. This wasn't royal dignity, it was the biological result of close family intermarriage. But Tutankhamun was hardly unique. The entire 18th dynasty practiced close family marriages. Amenhotep III married his daughter Sitamun. When genetic testing became available, researchers discovered she wasn't just his wife, she was also the mother of some of his children. Amenhotep IV, later Akhenaten, married several of his daughters. One would go on to marry her brother Tutankhamun, making her both his sister and his wife simultaneously. Here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't hidden or shameful. Royal inscriptions proudly proclaimed these relationships. The title King's Sister, King's Wife was carved on temple walls and official documents. A stela from Amenhotep II's reign literally states, "His Majesty's heart was filled with love for his sister, and he made her his great royal wife." Imagine modern politicians announcing they'd married their siblings. The scandal would be enormous. But Egyptian subjects celebrated these unions as divine. The Ptolemaic period continued royal intermarriage traditions. Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra, married both her brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. This wasn't unusual for her dynasty. The Ptolemies practiced sibling marriage for 300 years straight. Ptolemy II started the tradition by marrying his full sister Arsinoe II, and it continued unbroken. By Cleopatra's time, the family tree had become extremely interconnected. Analysis of Ptolemaic remains shows progressive health issues, increased birth complications, shortened lifespans, and fertility problems that eventually ended the dynasty. But here's where it gets truly complex. They had religious justification that made perfect sense within their worldview. The myth of Isis and Osiris, the most important story in Egyptian religion, centered on a brother-sister couple who loved each other so deeply that even death couldn't separate them. Isis searched for Osiris's dismembered body, reassembled it, and then brought him back to life long enough to conceive their son Horus. This wasn't just a myth, it was the template for royal behavior. Archaeological evidence shows just how normalized royal intermarriage was. Marriage contracts between royal siblings have been found with the same legal language as any other marriage. A papyrus from the Ptolemaic period discusses dowry arrangements between a brother and sister as casually as we'd discuss a prenup. Temple reliefs show brother-sister couples in intimate poses, with hieroglyphic labels proudly identifying their relationship. The Edwin Smith papyrus includes medical advice for conditions common in divine marriages. They knew the biological consequences, but considered them acceptable for maintaining divine bloodlines. Foreign rulers were constantly confused by Egyptian marriage customs. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE, include multiple instances of foreign kings expressing shock at Egyptian proposals. One Babylonian king wrote, "You ask for my daughter's hand while being wed to your own blood? This is not done among civilized peoples." The Egyptian response essentially said, "You wouldn't understand. It's a divine matter." Diplomatic marriages became complicated when foreign princesses discovered they were expected to share their husband with his sisters. The health consequences were severe and well documented. The remains of Tutankhamun's two stillborn daughters, from his sister wife, showed severe genetic abnormalities. The infants had conditions incompatible with life. But here's the really poignant part. The Egyptians mummified these tragic infants with the same care as healthy royals, believing they'd be reborn perfect in the afterlife. They knew the physical cost, but prioritized divine bloodline purity. Royal intermarriage had political advantages beyond religious justification. It kept power and wealth within the family. It prevented foreign influence on the throne. It eliminated succession disputes. Who could challenge a pharaoh married to every potential rival? The practice was so effective that some non-royal elite families began copying it. Studies of middle-class mummies from the late period show increasing rates of close family marriages, though never approaching royal levels. Modern Egyptologists struggled to accept the extent of royal intermarriage for decades. Early scholars assumed the titles were ceremonial, that sister meant beloved rather than biological sibling. It took extensive analysis to prove that no, when Egyptian texts said the pharaoh married his sister, they meant his actual, biological, same-parent's sister. The evidence is so overwhelming that denying it would be like denying scientific facts. Yet museums still dance around this reality, using euphemisms like consolidated royal bloodlines instead of stating the obvious. We worry about distant cousin marriages. Ancient Egyptian royalty married their actual siblings and called it divine duty. Makes your family dynamics seem pretty normal, doesn't it? But royal marriage practices were just the beginning of their unusual customs. Wait until you hear what everyday Egyptians were doing, and more importantly, what they were using for birth control. Spoiler alert, it involves unexpected animal products, and yes, they use them exactly how you're imagining. If you thought marrying your sister was the peak of Egyptian strangeness, you're not prepared for what regular people were doing to avoid pregnancy. If you complain about modern birth control side effects, you need to hear what ancient Egyptian women were dealing with. Imagine your physician prescribing a mixture of crocodile droppings, honey, and sodium carbonate for intimate use. This wasn't some back-alley remedy. This was legitimate medical advice written in official papyrus documents by trained physicians. But here's the remarkable part. It actually worked. Sort of. The ancient Egyptians were so romantically active that they developed the world's first comprehensive contraceptive system, complete with barrier methods, chemical preventatives, and even pregnancy termination techniques. They had no concept of virginity, literally no word for it in their language. Premarital relations? Totally acceptable. Multiple partners? Your business. They were basically living by modern standards while the rest of the ancient world was still figuring out agriculture. The Kahun gynecological papyrus, dating to 1800 BCE, reads like an ancient health manual. Here's an actual prescription. Crocodile droppings mixed with fermented dough, applied as directed. Another recipe calls for honey mixed with ground dates and acacia gum. A third suggests lint soaked in acacia juice. But here's what modern scientists discovered. These weren't random ingredients. Crocodile droppings are alkaline, creating conditions hostile to conception. Acacia gum contains lactic acid, a known spermicide still used today. The honey created a barrier, while also having antimicrobial properties. These ancient birth control methods had actual scientific basis. The Ebers papyrus, from 1550 BCE, gets even more detailed. It describes a pessary made from sodium carbonate mixed with honey. Instructions specify exact measurements and timing. Another method involved a mixture of ground dates, acacia, and honey on a wool pad. The papyrus even includes effectiveness ratings. Some methods were marked as proven, while others were under observation. They were conducting clinical trials 3,500 years before modern medicine existed. But wait, it gets more sophisticated. Egyptian women understood fertility cycles. The Berlin Papyrus describes counting days from menstruation to identify fertile periods. While not perfectly accurate, it shows remarkable biological understanding for the Bronze Age. They also had pregnancy tests. Women would urinate on bags of wheat and barley. If the wheat sprouted, it predicted a boy. Barley meant a girl. Neither meant not pregnant. Modern testing found this method actually has a 70% accuracy rate due to hormones in pregnant women's urine affecting seed germination. Archaeological evidence supports these textual sources. Excavations at Deir el Medina the village of royal tomb builders, uncovered numerous contraceptive devices, small bronze implements for removing pessaries, ceramic vessels with residue matching contraceptive recipes, even specialized furniture, an examination chair that could be converted for various uses. These workers weren't elite, they were middle class. If tomb builders had this technology, contraception was mainstream throughout Egyptian society. Here's what's truly revolutionary: Egyptian women's personal freedom. The absence of a virginity concept meant women weren't property to be transferred pure from father to husband. Marriage contracts show women keeping their own property, initiating divorce, and claiming alimony. The instructions of Tahotep advises men to ensure their wives' satisfaction in all aspects of marriage. Compare this to ancient Greece, where women were locked in separate quarters, or ancient Rome, where a woman's infidelity was punishable by death. Divorce papyri reveal the casual nature of Egyptian relationships. One document from the 12th century BCE states, "If you take another woman to your bed, I shall leave and take my property." Not outrage, but a simple statement of consequences. Another divorce lists incompatibility as grounds for separation. Women could literally divorce their husbands for any reason. Try finding that in other ancient legal codes. The Turin Papyrus, often called the world's first educational material about intimacy, wasn't actually scandalous, it was educational. Dating to 1150 BCE, it shows various positions and techniques with accompanying text. But here's the crucial detail: it includes contraceptive advice for each position. This wasn't hidden material, but practical instruction for married couples. The fact it survived shows it wasn't considered shameful or worth destroying. Even professional companionship was regulated and protected. The term harimtu referred to temple companions who served fertility deities. But secular workers existed too, and they had legal rights. Contracts survive, showing workers suing clients for non-payment. One papyrus records a worker successfully claiming property rights against a client who tried to cheat her. They had better legal protection than workers in many modern countries. Egyptian medical understanding of reproduction was remarkably advanced. They recognized that both men and women contributed to conception, revolutionary when other cultures believed women were just vessels for male seed. The Kahun Papyrus describes examining cervical conditions to determine fertility. They understood the connection between menstruation and pregnancy. They even attempted fertility treatments, including fumigation with incense to open the womb. The social acceptance of contraception reveals Egyptian pragmatism. In a narrow river valley dependent on annual floods, population control was essential. Too many children meant starvation when floods failed. Contraception wasn't just personal choice, it was social responsibility. Temple inscriptions praise women who knew when to open and close their wombs. Family planning was religious duty, not rebellion against nature. We're still arguing about birth control coverage in 2024, while ancient Egyptians were handing out crocodile-dropping prescriptions 4,000 years ago. They had more personal freedom than some societies do today. But if you think their earthly romantic lives were liberated, wait until you hear what they believed happened after death. Because apparently, dying didn't mean the party was over, it was just getting started in the afterlife. And when I tell you what they did to prepare their bodies for eternal vitality, you're going to understand why Victorian archaeologists spent so much time censoring their findings. Most religions promise peace, harmony, maybe some harps and clouds in the afterlife. Ancient Egyptians promised eternal vitality and pleasure. I'm not exaggerating. They literally believed that death was just the beginning of an endless paradise of regeneration and joy, and they prepared for it like they were packing for the world's most important journey. We're talking about a civilization that prepared bodies with special preservation techniques to ensure eternal vitality. Why? Because how else were you supposed to enjoy the afterlife? The Turin Papyrus isn't some ancient material hidden in someone's tomb. It's an instruction manual for eternal enjoyment. They buried people with items for personal pleasure. Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't just filled with gold. It was equipped for eternal vitality. This isn't speculation. We have the evidence to prove it. Let's start with the most shocking discovery. When researchers began analyzing mummies in the early 2000s, they found something that made them question their equipment. Bodies had been prepared with special techniques to preserve vitality for eternity. Not symbolic preservation, anatomically detailed preparation using resin-soaked linen. The mummy of Tutankhamun shows this preparation. Ramesses II shows it. Even non-royal mummies from the late period show evidence of special preservation techniques. This wasn't grave robbers' vandalism, this was standard mummification practice. The religious texts explain why. The Book of the Dead, the instruction manual for navigating the afterlife, contains spells specifically for maintaining vitality in the field of reeds. Spell 69 ensures the deceased shall have power for eternity. Another spell promises eternal youth and vigor. The afterlife wasn't about playing harps on clouds, it was about eternal youth, beauty, and unlimited enjoyment with whoever you wanted. But here's where it gets truly remarkable. The Egyptians believed you could enjoy divine company in the afterlife. The Book of Coming Forth by Day describes deceased individuals joining the gods in eternal celebration. One passage describes the deceased declaring, "I have union with the divine forces of creation." These weren't metaphorical spiritual unions. The hieroglyphics are explicitly about regeneration and vitality. Imagine heaven, but everyone's enjoying eternal youth and vigor. That's the Egyptian paradise. The grave goods prove they took this seriously. The tomb of Nefertari, Ramesses II's favorite wife, contained items for personal care and pleasure. Tutankhamun's tomb included oils and unguents labeled for eternal vitality. Even poor people's graves contained small amulets ensuring everyone could participate in the eternal celebration, regardless of economic status. The Turin papyrus, long misunderstood as ancient art, is actually labeled Positions for Eternity. Recent translation work revealed it's not just showing activities, it's showing positions only achievable with the magical flexibility granted in the Prusans. Afterlife. One scene shows impossible acrobatics, with hieroglyphics explaining, "In the field of reeds, the body knows no limits." This was a training manual for pleasures you couldn't even attempt while alive. Archaeological evidence keeps supporting these beliefs. In 2018, excavators at Saqqara found a tomb with walls covered in scenes of eternal vitality, not hidden in a back chamber, but in the main burial room. The deceased, a middle-ranking official, is shown enjoying various activities with different partners, both human and divine. Hieroglyphic captions describe each scene in detail. The tomb preparation alone would have cost years of salary, showing how important eternal vitality was even to middle-class Egyptians. Mummification procedures specifically preserved or enhanced vital characteristics. The Edwin Smith papyrus describes techniques for ensuring eternal vitality. For wealthy individuals, this involved special preservation techniques. The poor made do with symbolic items, but everyone got some form of preparation for eternal vitality. The concept of fading away didn't exist. Everyone would enjoy full vitality in paradise, regardless of when they died. Even children's burials show preparation for eventual adult vitality. While not given adult preparation, children's mummies often included fertility amulets and texts promising that upon reaching appropriate age in the afterlife, they would enjoy full adult vigor. The concept of eternal childhood didn't exist. Everyone would become vibrant adults in paradise, regardless of when they died. The most remarkable aspect? Some tombs contain instructions for eternal regeneration and creation. Not in the royal tradition of earthly intermarriage, but based on the belief that in the afterlife, earthly limitations no longer applied. A papyrus from the Ptolemaic period explicitly states, "In the field of reeds, all become as gods, and gods know no forbidden unions." The afterlife was imagined as a place where every possible joy was not just permitted but encouraged. We can't even talk about the afterlife at dinner, and ancient Egyptians were planning their eternal vitality while still breathing. They turned death into the ultimate transformation. But even with all their openness about life and regeneration, they had one shocking taboo that reveals just how sophisticated their society really was. And it involves a 3-day waiting period that would make modern people lose their minds. Because while they celebrated every imaginable form of vitality, there was one line even the ancient Egyptians wouldn't cross. For a civilization that celebrated divine creation and buried people with items for eternal vitality, you'd think nothing was off limits. Wrong. The ancient Egyptians had one taboo so serious that they created an elaborate system to prevent it, and what they were preventing will disturb you more than everything else combined. When people of high status died, their families kept the bodies at home for 3 days before sending them to embalmers, not for mourning, not for ceremonies, but to ensure decomposition would deter any inappropriate treatment of the deceased. Yes, you heard that right. Violation of the deceased was such a concern that they literally waited for natural processes to make bodies less vulnerable. Herodotus documented this practice with barely concealed horror, and modern archaeologists have confirmed it was standard procedure. The same civilization that celebrated every other aspect of human vitality drew a hard line at death. Herodotus, writing in 440 BCE, couldn't believe what his Egyptian guides told him. Wives of men of rank when they die are not given at once to be embalmed, nor such women as are very beautiful or of greater regard than others, but on the 3rd or 4th day after their death, and not before. They do so for this reason, that the embalmers may not violate the eternal rest of the deceased. He goes on to describe an incident where an embalmer was caught acting inappropriately with remains, leading to the formal establishment of the waiting period. But here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't paranoid superstition. Papyrus court records from Deir el-Medina document actual cases. One from the 19th dynasty describes an embalmer named Paneb, who was accused of violating the eternal rest of Lady Taweret before her time of waiting had passed. The punishment? He was sentenced to the most severe penalty available, his own premature mummification. The message was clear: violate the dead, face the ultimate punishment. The 3-day rule reveals sophisticated understanding of decomposition. Egyptian embalmers knew exactly how long a body remained vulnerable in the hot climate. 3 days in Egyptian heat meant significant changes that would deter even the most disturbed individuals. Families would keep bodies in special waiting rooms, well-ventilated chambers where nature could take its course. The wealthy hired guards to ensure no one attempted early collection. Archaeological evidence supports these practices. Multiple tomb paintings show the delivery of the prepared, families bringing bodies to embalmers after the waiting period. The artistic convention shows these bodies with clear signs of natural change, obviously indicating decomposition. Contrast this with scenes of royal mummification, where pharaohs were embalmed immediately due to constant supervision and religious protection. What's truly revealing is how systematic the protection was. The Rhine papyrus includes contracts between families and embalmers with specific clauses about the waiting period. One states, should the embalmer accept the body before natural change is evident, the contract is void and criminal proceedings may commence. Families could sue embalmers who collected bodies too early, even if no violation occurred. The legal system recognized the vulnerability and built in protections. The taboo extended beyond practical concerns to religious horror. Egyptians believed that violation of remains could trap the deceased soul, preventing their journey to the afterlife. The Book of the Dead includes spells specifically against those who would defile the body in its house of eternity. Tomb inscriptions threaten violators with eternal punishment, not just death, but complete annihilation of their soul, the worst fate imaginable in Egyptian religion. But here's the really complex part. The taboo only applied to the vulnerable period. Once properly mummified, the body became a sacred object, protected by different rules. The waiting period was specifically about the dangerous time between death and mummification. Some scholars suggest this indicates the taboo wasn't about respecting the dead, but about maintaining ritual purity. Remains in transition were liminal, neither living nor properly prepared. Contact during this period was cosmically dangerous. The profession of embalming itself became suspect due to these concerns. Embalmers lived in separate quarters outside towns, almost like a caste system. They were well paid but socially isolated. Marriage contracts from the late period show families specifically excluding embalmers as potential husbands for their daughters. The stigma was so strong that embalmers often worked in family businesses, unable to find other employment despite their valuable skills. Even transportation of bodies followed strict protocols. Female remains were wrapped in additional layers and transported in closed containers, while male bodies could be carried openly. Guard records from the valleys of the kings and queens show special patrols during the waiting days when bodies were vulnerable. One papyrus describes guards catching grave robbers who arrived too early, before mummification. They weren't after treasure, but vulnerable remains. The 3-day rule had unexpected social consequences. It became a status symbol to be embalmed immediately after death, indicating either royal blood or absolute trust in the embalmers. Cleopatra famously arranged for immediate mummification, declaring, "My beauty shall not wait for time." The ability to bypass the waiting period became another marker of elite privilege, though most still followed traditional protocols. We worry about funeral costs and flower arrangements. Ancient Egyptians worried about protecting their loved ones from violation before mummification. It's a disturbing reminder that even in the most open society in history, some lines couldn't be crossed. But this taboo makes sense when you understand how vitality and regeneration were literally built into every aspect of their civilization, including their architecture. And when I tell you what those obelisks really represent, you'll never be able to visit a museum the same way again. You've walked past them in museums, seen them in movies, maybe even touched one on vacation. But did you know that every Egyptian obelisk represents divine creative power? And those temple doorways you walked through? Congratulations, you've symbolically experienced rebirth. The ancient Egyptians didn't just practice sacred regeneration, they built it into every structure, every monument, every architectural decision. The Washington Monument? It's based on a symbol of divine creation. Place de la Concorde in Paris? Monument to regenerative power. These aren't conspiracy theories or modern interpretations. The Egyptians were completely explicit about what these structures represented. Obelisks were symbols of divine creative force reaching toward the heavens, channeling regenerative energy between earth and sky. Temple doorways represented the passages of life, and passing through them was ritual rebirth. Even the annual Nile flood was understood as divine blessing fertilizing Mother Egypt. Let's start with the obvious, obelisks. The Egyptian word for obelisk was teyen, which literally meant protection or defense. These weren't subtle metaphors. Temple inscriptions explicitly describe obelisks as symbols of Ra's creative power piercing the dome of heaven. The capstone, or pyramidion, represented the first ray of sunlight. The shaft represented divine strength. When the morning sun hit the gold-covered pyramidion, it symbolized divine illumination bringing light to the world. Every sunrise was a moment of cosmic creation. But here's what tour guides won't tell you. Obelisk placement was deliberately symbolic. They were always erected in pairs at temple entrances, representing duality and balance. The temple doorway between them symbolized the passage of life. Passing between the obelisks and through the door meant ritual transformation and rebirth. The Karnak temple has multiple sets of obelisks and doorways, creating a sequence of symbolic rebirths just to reach the inner sanctuary. The evidence is carved in stone. Hieroglyphic inscriptions on the Lateran obelisk, now in Rome, explicitly state, "The golden light of Ra flows from my peak at dawn, bringing life to the land of Egypt." Another at Luxor declares, "I stand eternal, the creative power of Atum made stone." These aren't modern interpretations, these are literal translations of ancient texts. The Egyptians wanted everyone to know exactly what these monuments represented. Temple doorways were equally symbolic. The standard Egyptian temple entrance, called a pylon, was designed to represent the horizon where the sun rises. The sloping sides represented the mountains of the horizon. The horizontal lintel was the sky. Passing through meant symbolically, traveling with the sun from night to day, from death to rebirth. The inner passages of temples narrowed progressively, creating a journey toward the sacred center where only priests could enter. Modern cities are filled with Egyptian symbolic architecture, and nobody realizes it. The Vatican has the largest collection of Egyptian obelisks outside Egypt, 13 monuments to creative power decorating the center of Catholic Christianity. London's Cleopatra's Needle, New York's Central Park Obelisk, the Place de la Concorde Obelisk in Paris, all ancient symbols of regeneration now serving as tourist attractions. Millions take selfies with 3,000-year-old monuments to divine creation every year. But obelisks were just the beginning. Column designs in Egyptian temples represented bundled papyrus plants, symbols of regeneration and new growth. The capitals, tops of columns, often featured lotus or papyrus flowers opening, symbols of rebirth and renewal. An entire hypostyle hall, like the one at Karnak with 134 massive columns, created a forest of symbolic regeneration inside the sacred space of the temple. Even pyramid design had regenerative symbolism. The pyramid represented the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of chaos, the first solid matter created by divine power. The ascending passage inside pyramids symbolized the path of transformation. The burial chamber represented the womb where transformation and rebirth occurred. The entire structure was a massive architectural diagram of creation and regeneration. Archaeological discoveries keep revealing more symbolic architecture. In 2020, researchers using ground-penetrating radar at Saqqara discovered that temple foundations were deliberately shaped to represent concepts of creation and life. Underground chambers beneath the Temple of Ptah form specific symbolic shapes. These weren't coincidences. They required massive additional excavation and engineering to achieve forms that would never be seen above ground. The Egyptians even built symbolic sounds into their architecture. Recent acoustic analysis of temple chambers shows they were designed to amplify and echo certain frequencies, specifically those matching human expressions of joy and celebration. Priests performing rituals would have their voices transformed and amplified by the architecture itself. The temples were literally designed to resonate with life and vitality. Water features in temples had regenerative significance too. Sacred lakes represented the primordial waters from which life emerged. Priests bathed in these lakes before rituals, symbolically returning to the moment of creation. The drainage systems were designed to create specific sounds reminiscent of flowing water. Even the twice-daily temple rituals involved awakening the god statue, a ceremony of bringing divine vitality to life each day. The orientation of temples followed symbolic principles. Most faced east-west, allowing the rising sun to penetrate the doorway at dawn, bringing divine light into the sanctuary. But some faced the Nile, positioned so the annual flood would symbolically bring life-giving waters to the temple. The Temple of Khnum at Esna has channels carved to direct floodwater into the sanctuary, literally allowing the Nile's life-giving waters to bless the Holy of Holies. This symbolic architecture wasn't limited to religious buildings. Palace designs incorporated the same symbolism. The pharaoh's throne room often featured twin obelisks and a doorway behind the throne, positioning the king at the point of divine power. Royal chambers were built with specific proportions matching sacred ratios found in religious texts. Even common houses had doorways designed with symbolic curves, ensuring every Egyptian experienced ritual passages multiple times daily. Millions of tourists photograph ancient Egyptian monuments every year and have no idea what they represent. We've surrounded ourselves with their symbolic architecture while completely missing the point. The Egyptians understood that creation and regeneration weren't things to hide away. They were the fundamental forces that kept the universe running. Which brings us to the ultimate question: how did the most life-affirming civilization in history influence the world we live in today? The answer might surprise you more than everything else you've learned. Remember when I promised you'd never look at an obelisk the same way? Well, now you know you're looking at a 3,000-year-old monument to divine creative power. We've journeyed through a civilization where gods created the universe through self-generation, where pharaohs married their sisters as religious duty, where people used crocodile droppings for birth control, and where mummies were equipped for eternal vitality. The ancient Egyptians didn't just accept human nature, they built their entire world around it. Every temple, every festival, every religious practice celebrated the creative force that they believed kept the universe in balance. What modern society hides, they carved in stone. What we whisper about, they shouted from pyramid tops. And somehow, this remarkably open civilization lasted longer than any other in human history. Think about what we've discovered today. A creation myth centered on divine self-generation that shaped 3,000 years of culture. A fertility god prominently displayed and paraded through streets in festivals that made Mardi Gras look tame. Royal siblings marrying each other for so many generations their family trees became family circles. Women using innovative contraceptives while having more personal freedom than they'd see again for millennia. Dead people buried with symbolic items and instruction manuals for eternal vitality. A society so concerned about protecting the deceased, they let bodies decompose before embalming. Architecture that was literally one giant celebration of life and regeneration after another. Here's what this reveals about human nature. Our modern taboos aren't natural or inevitable. They're recent inventions. The Egyptians proved that a society can be remarkably open, celebrate life and vitality, give women reproductive freedom, and still build wonders of the world. They lasted 3,000 years with divine creation as their origin story. We can barely handle basic health education in schools. Maybe the question isn't why they were so different, but why we became so restrictive. They saw creation and regeneration as sacred forces. We often see them as shameful secrets. They built monuments to fertility. We build walls around natural discussions. The influence of Egyptian openness echoes through history in ways we don't recognize. Those obelisks in Rome, Paris, London, and New York. They're not just stolen monuments, they're symbols of regeneration we've neutered through ignorance. The medical symbol of snakes wrapped around a staff? That's derived from Egyptian symbols of healing and regeneration. Even our word chemistry comes from Kemet, the Egyptian word for their land, where natural philosophy and science intertwined. We've inherited their symbols while completely forgetting their meanings. But hey, at least we don't have to use crocodile droppings for birth control, right? And our wedding ceremonies don't require marrying our siblings. Modern dating might be complicated, but it's paradise compared to having your marriage arranged with your brother. We complain about dating apps, but imagine if your only options were your immediate family members. So next time you're frustrated with modern relationships, just remember, you could be living in ancient Egypt, trying to impress your sister while preparing crocodile-dropping contraceptives for your eternal afterlife adventures. The Egyptians understood something we've forgotten, that life, creation, and regeneration are the fundamental forces of the universe. They took this belief to extremes we find shocking, but their civilization thrived for longer than any other in human history. They built monuments that still inspire awe, developed medicine we still use, created art we still treasure, all while celebrating aspects of life we often hide. Maybe the lesson isn't that they were strange, but that we're too restrictive. Next time you see an obelisk, you'll know exactly what you're looking at. Next time you walk through a museum's Egyptian collection, you'll understand why Victorian archaeologists censored so much evidence. Next time someone complains about modern values, you can tell them about a civilization that made our most progressive ideas look conservative. The ancient Egyptians proved that an open society doesn't lead to collapse, that it can lead to 3,000 years of continuous civilization. If this video amazed you, hit subscribe because we're just getting started, exploring history's most incredible practices. Comment below which Egyptian custom surprised you the most. And remember, every time you see an obelisk, you'll know exactly what you're looking at. Share this video with someone who thinks they know ancient history. Let's see if they can handle the truth about humanity's most fascinating civilization.